Get your motherfucking ass up when I'm talking. You some Justin Bieber, Miley Cyrus looking motherfuckers. And sometimes I get angry. So suck a dick.
Hola, mi amigos, and we're back. In 2002, Dana White finally got ESPN, the magazine, to send Bill Simmons to a UFC event for a 2-page column, but it did not go as planned because at the 39th UFC event, Bill Simmons described the fight between Tim Sylvia and Wesley Carrera as, and I quote, practically amateur night, comparing them to rejects from a tough man contest. The author would compare the UFC to Japan's mixed martial arts competition called Pride. Even though Pride had events that would be watched by more than 20 million Japanese viewers, and the UFC at that time wasn't getting anywhere near that amount of viewers. He also speaks of a Japanese fighter named Sakuraba, who earned the nickname the Gracie Hunter for beating 4 different members of the Gracie family over a 13-month span, including a 90-minute battle against Royce Gracie, which gave Royce his first professional loss. Dana White spoke with Jeff Sherwood, who created SureDog.com, one of the most popular mixed martial arts websites at the time. Jeff Sherwood said that Dana White would call and say, and I quote, "Going to be the only MMA show around, I guarantee you. You need to get on board. You don't need to cover that shit in Japan anymore. Be one of my guys," unquote. While revenues did rise from $4.5 million in 2001 to $8.7 million in 2002, the production costs were up more than $10 million, so they were putting out more money than they were actually making. Lorenzo Fertitta in 2002 says, and I quote, "Unfortunately, it seems that the fans were more interested in tuning into a spectacle or a car wreck than a true sporting event." The book doesn't really clarify what Lorenzo was referring to when that was said, but it was said, and there you go. The author speaks of Charles Lewis, who made an apparel company called Tap Out, selling t-shirts in parking lots and befriending hundreds of fighters, whom they gave small sponsorship fees, typically around $300, to wear their shirts in the cage. They gave shirts away for free as often as they sold them. At the 36th UFC event, Tap Out logo appeared on the octagon mat. Charles Lewis hadn't paid anything for the placement, and no one at Tap Out knew it would even be featured until the day of the event. Charles Lewis says, and I quote, "They didn't even tell us," unquote. The travel website Expedia.com had been the highest profile sponsor for the UFC at that time. The author also speaks of Joe Rogan, who worked as the UFC's backstage interviewer in 1997. After Joe Rogan saw his first UFC fight, he'd begun training in jiu-jitsu first at, this is what it says in the book. I'm not sure if that's true, because I'm pretty sure that Joe Rogan was already in some sort of mixed martial arts and taekwondo before he seen anything about the UFC. That's just what it says in the book. But let's continue. After Joe Rogan saw his first UFC fight, he'd begun training in jiu-jitsu first at Rickson Gracie's Academy in West Los Angeles and later at Carlson Gracie's Academy in Hollywood. SEG couldn't pay Rogan's $1,500 fee, and he stopped appearing on the broadcast, but he still remained a fan and continued coming to UFC events on his own. Rogan also grew up in Massachusetts, 15 miles away from Boston. Joe Rogan and Dana White would have dinner together after the fights, and Dana White would ask Joe Rogan to rejoin the broadcast team, but Joe Rogan declined, saying, and I quote, "I was like, I don't want to work, man. I just want to go watch the fights and swear and scream and get drunk like everybody else," unquote. Jeff Blatnick was fired after UFC 32 because, according to McCarthy, Dana White didn't like anything about him, from his looks to his commenting skills. Jeff Blatnick was replaced at UFC 33 by Jeff Osborne, an experienced martial artist. After a year, Osborne was politely fired after he was told by an executive producer that the company simply wanted to shake things up. Rogan replaced Osborne as a commentator at UFC 40 in November 2002. Joe Rogan says, and I quote, "I only did it because Dana was a friend," unquote. Initially, Joe Rogan agreed to work for no salary and asked only for the UFC to pay for his travel expenses and a few extra tickets to share with his friends. I thought that was hilarious. Dana White called a man named Don Gold, whose name was in the credits of an old UFC tape. Gold used to work for the UFC. Dana White wanted to make extra revenue, so he pretty much asked Don Gold to work for him again and get him connections to sell DVDs. Don Gold first declined, then he accepted, but the connection that he got or was able to get was Best Buy. And Best Buy basically didn't want too much to do with the UFC, but Don Gold talked them into buying 500 copies to rent out in Best Buy stores. Dana White found out what branches in Las Vegas had the DVDs, and Dana would stop in periodically to move the UFC titles to the front of the racks. That's some hustler shit. That's some dope shit. The author also speaks on Tank Abbott's fight with Wesley Carrera. He calls it a 2-minute sloppy fight that ended when a huge gash opened above Abbott's right eye, and the doctor wrote it unsafe for him to continue. Wesley Carrera celebrated by flipping him off. A shoving match broke out between the two camps, forcing the cage to be cleared. Abbott tried to pull the microphone out of Bruce Buffer's hand to address the crowd, but he was taken away by security. So this next part that the author speaks on is even confusing me, because pretty much Lorenzo Fertitta put in about $30 million at this point by 2003, and he called Dana White and said, and I quote, "I can't keep spending my family's money," unquote. Then Dana White goes through his phone looking through contacts for someone who might be able to buy the UFC from the Fertittas, and Dana White thought to himself, it's over, we didn't make it. So long story short, Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta have a conversation about a plan to save the UFC, and they basically said, well, we'll give this one last final shot, and they're going to try to come up with some sort of plan so that the company could gain some actual money. This resulted in Lorenzo speaking to a television producer named Craig Pilagan and Kevin Kay, who was the vice president of programming at Spike TV. They basically had to do the same thing that they always did and invite Kevin Kay and Craig Pilagan to a UFC event in person to try to persuade them into getting the show on the air. So chapter 4 wasn't necessarily short, but the number of topics that I thought were important, there weren't many. So I'm doing chapter 5 in this video also. So without going into massive detail, Dana White, Lorenzo Fertitta, and their small production company, which according to the book consists of only 4 employees during 2005, Kevin Kay and Craig Pilagan came up with a crazy idea for a UFC reality show. 18 fighters would live together in a Las Vegas mansion and compete in a series of weekly stunts. The losing group will have to eliminate a teammate until they were only down to 2 finalists, in which who would fight each other in the octagon. Whoever won the fight would win the tournament and be offered a 6-figure contract to compete in the UFC. Now, personally, I thought that that was a crazy idea because it has nothing to do with the UFC. Even Kevin Kay says, and I quote, "You start to know them as characters, you figure it out, and it ends in a fight 13 weeks later. By then, hopefully they'll be prepared," unquote. And by prepared, he means prepared for the fight. So from what I read, I'm thinking like Jersey Shore with elimination rounds. And after competing in stunts that have nothing to do with the fight or nothing to do with fighting, the 2 guys at the end get into a fight 13 weeks later in the octagon. It just sounds crazy. But they did end up changing up the scheme a little further down the line. And Frank III and Lorenzo said that if it failed, it will most likely be their last attempt at saving the UFC. Another crazy thing is that they scheduled a 52-day shoot in Las Vegas, but it would cost them $10 million. Personally, I'm not buying that either because Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta were so cheap that they offered Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell only $800 a week for an 8-week shoot to be coaches for The Ultimate Fighter, in which both fighters turned down. Chuck Liddell says, and I quote, "It was a sum so low that his manager Jim Gallo dropped him after he insisted on taking it," unquote. The UFC offered Ken Shamrock and Ortiz an offer to be coaches, but negotiations quickly fell apart over money. Also, $10 million just to produce the TV show for 52 days of filming without paying the contestants and only offering the coaches that are certified UFC fighters $800 a week doesn't make sense to me. Also, the author snuck this in there that Lorenzo grew anxious about coming out with the show, The Ultimate Fighter because they already had UFC's show The Contender coming out in March, but it was their show. So it's basically all the same promo. So they targeted that January to come out with The Ultimate Fighter, but I think that since NBC committed to putting up $30 million to produce 15 episodes of The Contender, that they knew it would be better, at least production-wise, than The Ultimate Fighter. So they wanted The Ultimate Fighter to drop first instead of The Contender, which was going to drop in March 2005, I'm pretty sure. Then it says that they had Sylvester Stallone and Sugar Ray Leonard as hosts for The Contender, and that still doesn't make sense. I don't even think Sylvester Stallone was a real boxer, but even though it's still like, why would you make a boxer a host for a show that's about mixed martial arts? It doesn't really make sense. Well, pretty much they say that the guys on the show had little firsthand knowledge of fighting. Then they say that they try to feed these guys by stocking the refrigerator with Hot Pockets, Snickers, and ice cream bars, processed junk food. And after the complaints, Dana White had to arrange for someone to run to the grocery store and deliver fresh meats and vegetables. Then they said that in the gym, they couldn't run the air conditioning system during filming because of the noise and the electric load. It says that the fighters had to work out with no ventilation, and it drove several into serious dehydration after a treadmill run. But if you're dehydrated, why didn't they just drink water? The air conditioning system isn't going to keep you hydrated. Am I wrong? Who knows? The level of shenanigans here is insane. So the first elimination challenge was to carry their respective coaches on their shoulders while he was seated in a 200-pound lazy boy recliner. And whichever team gets through the race course circuit first wins. And that doesn't have shit to do with the UFC at all. Then one of the fighters, Mike Swick, tripped and fell on the rocks on Lake Mead, opening a gash on his shin that he worried could harm him for the rest of the season. Mike Swick says, and I quote, "It was so pointless," unquote. It says that the production team began to have many of the same concerns as the fighters. They were making a show about mixed martial arts, and after 2 weeks, no one was ever shown fighting. So Dana, Lorenzo, and the team switched the scheme of the entire show. The fighters learned that they would have to weigh in at their official weight class before every bout. Some fighters potentially having to lose as much as 20 pounds or more in just a few days' notice. A fighter, Kara Alexis, says, and I quote, "We were kind of just stuck in the moment, like, whoa, we're going out and fighting and not getting paid," unquote. Lorenzo is on set. The fighters are trying to quit, so Lorenzo calls Dana White, who isn't on set, to come down from a meeting and talk to the guys. He gets there and basically tells the guys some bullshit, basically saying that they shouldn't be putting money over opportunity and that if they really wanted to be fighters, then they would just fight. So basically, a fuck you and you're not getting paid. A fighter by the name of Southworth says, and I quote, "None of us have a problem with fighting, Dana. Nobody here has a problem with that." Later on, Dana White says, and I quote, "I don't even remember exactly what I said to them or anything like that. I was like, oh man, this is going to be bad," unquote. And that's because the cameras were rolling when he was saying that to them, when he was talking to them. Oh, and a cool little fun fact, well, not a cool little fun fact, but fun fact, or just fact, Dana White has Meniere's disease, and he had his hearing permanently damaged after losing a street fight. Never knew that. A fighter by the last name Swick, that's Mike Swick, recalls the producers yelling out, "Conserve reality, guys, conserve reality," which basically meant that they had to stop the conversation and continue that conversation when they got in front of the cameras. Thought that was funny. WWE was on Spike TV in 2005, and the time slot that it ran in was around 8 p.m. So by the time the WWE went off is when the UFC wanted The Ultimate Fighter to come on, because the WWE would get 4 to 5 million viewers and the two shows have similarities. So the UFC's producers thought that they would be able to take some of the WWE's fan base. So the first episode had 1.6 million viewers and February's episode had about 2 million viewers. But when Dana White flew to New York to meet with Viacom executives in hopes of signing a deal for a second season, but they left him empty-handed. The UFC's annual revenue doubled from what it had been 1 year earlier, and this is before a single pay-per-view had been sold. The Ultimate Fighter finale drew in an average of 2.6 million viewers and peaked at more than 10 million during the Boner-Griffin fight. Charles Lewis tap-out website online orders jumped from around 10 orders an hour to more than 3,000 orders an hour. And 1 week later, for the UFC's 52nd event with Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell fighting, their pay-per-view buys skyrocketed to a reported 280,000 buys, making it the best-selling UFC event of that time. They also brought in another $2.5 million from ticket sales at the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada. Dana White and the UFC tried to get a deal with HBO, but HBO sports executives turned them down. Specifically, Seth Abraham, the same executive to sign Mike Tyson a 10-fight contract in 1986. Seth Abraham says, and I quote, "When HBO attaches itself to boxing, it attaches itself to Joe Louis, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Muhammad Ali. It attaches itself to history, achievement, and glory. UFC has none of those things, and it will tarnish HBO's boxing franchise. Will UFC get good ratings? Probably, but so would naked boxing." Unquote. The UFC also had a third-party company doing its production for them, and that external production company was through Concom Inc., which was ran by a ESPN executive, Scotty Canal, and his son Bruce. HBO Sports agreed to work with the UFC, but under the condition that the UFC approve all of the changes that it would make to the UFC's presentation. The changes that HBO Sports wanted to make was basically almost everything. To the pre-fight introduction videos, lowering the volume of the fighters, walkout music, having fights take place in a roped-off ring like Pride, rather than the UFC's octagon cage. They was trying to have him fight in a boxing ring. Epstein says that Dana White said, and I quote, "We've controlled our own destiny. We've controlled our own brand. Our own look and feel is unique and special. And then we're going to essentially allow HBO to slap their production standards and all that on our event," unquote. UFC 70 was supposed to be the first event aired by HBO Sports in North America, but Zuffa and HBO couldn't come to the terms with how to handle the production together. And by the time the deadline had passed, they still had no deal. So then Dana White persuaded Spike TV to air the event as a free broadcast instead of a pay-per-view. Also in 2005, Spike TV's agreement with the WWE came to an end, and Spike TV decided not to renew the deal. And in the book, it says that was because of the flat ratings and diminishing interest in pro wrestling from advertisers. And personally, I'm not sure if that's true or not, and I'm not really buying that either, because they literally just said that the WWE was getting 4 to 5 million viewers per episode, which was the reason why they wanted the Ultimate Fighter to come on after the WWE went off. So how in the same year did the WWE lose so many viewers? Matter of fact, not even in the same year. How in the same couple months the WWE lost so many viewers to the point that advertisers didn't even want to promote their commercials during the WWE's broadcast. Just didn't make sense. But that's just my opinion. Also, during this time, Zuffa and the UFC was coming out with more programs, one called UFC Unleashed and a biography series called All Access, hosted by Rachel Leah, one of the UFC's regular Octagon girls. A man named Paul Cambria, who was a post-production supervisor at Echo Entertainment Inc., oversaw All Access and Countdown for Spike TV. Paul Cambria says, and I quote, "At the time, the UFC just had no infrastructure to do anything in-house. We cut a piece, and I remember talking talking with Dana, it was like one of the one and only times where Dana got on the phone and he was just like, I want to see more blood. I want to see more blood. I'm like, what is wrong with this guy? What the fuck? He wanted the barker to be as violent as it could possibly be, unquote. In 2006, the UFC's annual revenue swelled up to $180 million. The Ultimate Fighter drew 5.7 million viewers. It was the most watched event in Spike TV history. The UFC's pay-per-views revenues grew to $222 million. Zuffa had taken $91 million and leaving the remainder to their various cable provider partners. The UFC increased its pay-per-view prices to $39.95. In May 2007, the UFC lost its biggest advocate at HBO. HBO's executive chairman and CEO Chris Albrecht had been arrested in Las Vegas for assaulting his girlfriend in the parking lot at the MGM Grand after a boxing match between Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Oscar De La Hoya. Chris Albrecht says, and I quote, I had been a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous for 13 years. 2 years ago, I decided that I could handle drinking again. Clearly, I was wrong, unquote. Chris entered a no contest plea and was issued a $1,000 fine, and the sentence was suspended. Rumors spread that other women who worked for him had behavioral complaints, and according to a report in the Los Angeles Times, HBO had paid a six-figure settlement to one dating as far back as 1991. So in September 2007, he cut ties with HBO and moved to IMG. Now, this story is kind of funny. So John McCarthy, the 6'4", 275-pound referee that had been a referee since the second UFC event, wrote a memoir. In this memoir, he says that after the 70th event, he began to think he might not have a place in the UFC at all. John McCarthy heard that the promotion had booked Joe Rogan and Bruce Buffer in first class for a 11-hour flight from Las Vegas to London for the UFC 70, which is the 70th event. And McCarthy asked if the UFC would be willing to buy him a first-class ticket to London. The request made it to Dana White. Dana White texts John McCarthy and says, and I quote, what the fuck is up with you, unquote. When McCarthy apologized and said he'd be willing to fly coach if there was no other alternative, Dana White told him not to bother even making the trip. The UFC would find another referee to replace him in England. Dana White wanted John McCarthy to train other referees for upcoming events, but John McCarthy was already working a full-time job as a trainer at the Los Angeles Police Department, and he felt like he was operating past his capacity by refereeing the UFC's events once a month. Dana White said he would take his issues to the Athletic Commission instead and ushered McCarthy out of Zuffa's offices. McCarthy says, and I quote, I think it was in that moment I knew I wasn't really a part of the UFC anymore, unquote. And we're done. And we're done.